and articles on Western history, among them racial borders, black soldiers along the Rio Grande, and the Northern Cheyenne Exodus in History and Memory, which was named a Kansas Notable Book and won the Great Plains Distinguished Book Prize. In 2009, he founded Johnson County Community College's Kansas Studies Institute, and I believe you're not directing it anymore, right?
That would be my college.
Yes, that's right. Ty is directing it now, but he directed it for many years. He serves on the board of the Kansas Business Hall of Fame and on the editorial boards of the journals Great Plains Quarterly, Kansas History. He's been involved in several National Endowment for the Humanities programs, both as consultant and participant, and was a Fulbright Hay Scholar in Egypt and Israel. And currently, he serves on the National College Board Committee that prepares the annual college-level examination program, exam for history and the social sciences. He earned his BS and MA degrees from Fort Hays State University and his PhD from the University of Kansas. So please welcome Dr. Leiker.
Thank you, Diane. How am I doing on the microphone? Can everybody hear? All right, so let me say that first, prior to meeting with Paul Wensky a few months ago to discuss the symposium, my knowledge of Quindaro was fairly limited. I was aware of it, of course, as an important site for Kansas's territorial period. I had visited on a couple of occasions, and I dimly knew about the controversies surrounding its development dating back to the 1980s. But I had not devoted the same kind of research attention as the scholars you've heard the last few days. In some ways, that detachment, that ability to approach the topic as an outsider with no horse in the race, proves beneficial for my task, which I hope to accomplish with honesty and bluntness. For the next few minutes, I'm going to offer a set of suggestions about takeaways. What can we as historians, preservationists, artists, and community builders learn from the story of this place? After I've presented 5 lessons from Quindaro, and these are just my 5 lessons, I'll invite your own observations. I think the organizers and all of the participants would like to hear from you as we grapple with the question of, hey, great conference, but so what? The first lesson, which seems most apparent, is that the efforts of the last 30-odd years at commemoration represent a desperate attempt to remember what was almost forgotten. How many times have we heard, "I was never taught this"? Quindaro's history has never been far from the minds of the people who live there. In fact, it has been residents' oral traditions and word of mouth that kept its cultural memory alive. What Tip O'Neill once said about politics holds true as well for history. Everything is local. But for an event or a place to be considered significant, it must offer something that resonates with outsiders. When words like ghost town and economic decline appear so frequently in descriptions, in light of much evidence to the contrary, clearly Quindaro's story has struggled to resonate with the larger narrative of American history, and even for that of the greater Kansas City area. Why? Let's think for a minute about what Carrie Meinking said yesterday. How do we make people care? I'm thinking particularly about the definition of a story, because historians are essentially storytellers, right? We're limited by primary sources, and we don't get to make stuff up like fiction writers do. But storytellers, nonetheless, who are obliged to present reality in narrative form. Historians have the power to decide which stories are worth telling and where those stories should begin and end. Likewise, audiences hold the power to decide, through the books they buy, the museums they visit, and the roadside attractions at which they stop, which stories are worth hearing. Ultimately, those decisions say more about us as tellers and listeners than they do about the site itself. Stories at heart are political, and they are driven by values. What we choose to remember, and perhaps more importantly, what we choose to forget, reveals who we are as a society. What does it reveal about us then, when a site like Quindaro can be so easily forgotten, and when even the most informed among us claim that the last development of significance happened there more than 150 years ago? In reviewing the literature on the archaeological dig from the 1980s, I came across a description by a Browning Ferris attorney as, quote, "just foundations under the ground, a few walls 3 to 4 feet high, nothing good to look at unless you're a pretty good dreamer." That, unfortunately, is an apt summation of how most Americans view the past, as something to see rather than ponder, affirming preconceived values rather than challenging them. Quindaro offers an opportunity for self-reflection, to ask why we value some parts of our past more than others. After the congratulations of this symposium are over, will we approach our historical consciousness, and by we, I don't necessarily mean the people in this room, will we approach it differently? Will we do so in the same, mostly failed ways that allowed the site to fall back into some obscurity, in need of rescuing by some archaeologist in the year 3100? Or are we receptive to telling and hearing Quindaro's story framed somewhat differently? The second lesson relates to the conception of Quindaro as a story of the mid-19th century, intimately connected to Kansas's Free State narrative. If you were here yesterday, the second lesson is also known as, well, duh. State and local history is largely booster-driven, resting on the need to distinguish one's community from the neighbors, to say, we're unique, we're different from those folks on the other side of the river. Kansans have been trying to distinguish themselves from Missourians for a long time, but not as long as you think. The leading consensus among scholars is that Kansas territory in the 1850s was more fixated on issues of real estate and acquisition of Indian land than it was on black slavery. Nicole Etchison addressed this yesterday. As dramatic and headline-grabbing as the activities of John Brown and William Quantrill were, the violence of so-called Bleeding Kansas was not representative of the typical settler's experience. Nor does the rhetoric of Free State Republicans halting slavery in its tracks appear in politicians' speeches or even the state's earliest histories until the end of the 19th century. What changed in the 1890s that caused state leaders to reach back almost a half century to locate a story highlighting their progressivism, their concern for freedom? Remembering that all stories serve someone's agenda, I submit that the populist challenge to the Republican Party provided that motivation. As editor William Allen White identified so clearly, Kansas Republicans, the party of big business, industrial expansion, and hyper-capitalism, came under attack by reformers demanding regulation of railroads, recognition of labor unions, an 8-hour workday, and other causes that would give farmers and workers a fair chance in the face of growing economic inequality. No surprise that Republicans seized the moment to distinguish their party from Democratic and populist challengers by maintaining theirs was the original party of freedom. Nor is it coincidental that in the late 1800s, as state officials across the Midwest tried to establish public historical societies, they faced taxpayers' inevitable questions of why? Why the need for government-run historical associations in states that were less than 40 or 50 years old? History serves community interests or it dies. Or in this case, if it could find no interest to serve, it would never have been born in the first place. In the Free State narrative, Kansas leaders found a story that served several interests at once, flattering their constituents by praising the state's victorious role in ending human bondage and defending the dominant party's rule against those who questioned its definition of freedom as limited and outdated. As a quick perusal of local history sections in bookstores or a scan of the articles published in Kansas History, a journal of the Central Plains, would illustrate, Kansans in 2018 have not deviated from that 1890s conception of themselves. Especially for this area, the Free State narrative, the saga of brave abolitionists making their idealistic stand against slavery's expansion, is Kansas's founding creation story. And like most creation stories, it is a myth. Myths are needed, but they should be labeled as such. In the first place, Free Staters were not Yankee abolitionists, but Midwestern capitalists disposed to dislike slavery and African Americans with equal fervor. More significantly, Kansas's reputation as a progressive haven, a racial sanctuary, is supported neither by record nor memory. The cold shoulder that white voters showed African Americans in debates over the 15th Amendment, the weak assistance provided to exodusters in the late 1870s, and the passage of segregation laws that would last until the Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka case in 1954 refute Kansans' conceptions of themselves as racially liberal. In answer to Reverend Evans' question from the other night, I don't think the Republican Party ever really changed. I think they learned to write their past with great efficiency and self-interest. Quindaro's historiography has traditionally been framed as a subset of that Free State myth. As multiple presenters have documented, its port of entry for the Free Soil movement was short-lived, declining as early as 1857 when the battle against pro-slavery forces started to be won. Though oral traditions are not, and should never be, discounted, written sources of the time, including the newspaper Chindowan, show little evidence that Quindaro served as a major focal point for the Underground Railroad. Clarina Nichols mentioned the possibility privately in the 1880s, and the earliest newspaper accounts that link the site to extensive fugitive activity do not appear until, not surprisingly, the 1890s. The story of Kansas, and by extension of Quindaro as a land of freedom, was cemented a few years later in a speech by Progressive Republican Teddy Roosevelt in his 1910 New Nationalism address in Osawatomie, close to John Brown's hideout, and by the dedication of the Brown statue around the same time in Quindaro itself, a spot which, based on all we can determine, Brown never actually visited. If history were nothing more than a cold archive of past events, then we would be most accurate in describing Quindaro not as a pillar of abolitionism, but as a failed real estate development scheme. Yet we all know it's more than that. We need stories that bind us to place and to each other and help guide us into uncertain futures. The question is, how much longer can a story of a temporary town enterprise from the 1850s continue to do that? As I like to joke with my colleagues like Chris Childers, who's not here, so therefore I'll pick on him, how much longer will the Civil War continue to hijack the 19th century? I mean, really, how much of the 1800s does it need? Clearly, the conflict between Union and Confederacy deserves its due. I'll maintain, however, that our selective focus on that part of our nation and this community's past has led us to overlook other stories, other ways to interpret Quindaro, which may prove useful for the road ahead. Consider the third lesson, that our understanding of Quindaro would be improved by extending the beginning of its story to an earlier period. What do we know about the French explorers who first viewed the site with European eyes? What do we know of the indigenous people like the Kansan, who predate the Delawares and Wyandots, and would certainly have utilized the spot to observe activity on the river below? Europeans today sneer at Americans' habit of calling ruins from the 1800s historical. Just as an Egyptian who grows up in the shadow of 5,000-year-old pyramids finds laughable Europeans' idea of history as a 17th century monarchical palace. Every part of the earth is as old as every other part. Our North American history is as old as the pyramids, yet we do not know. Native genocide also meant the loss of those oral stories that might have linked us, the newcomers, to this place in a lineage dating back millennia. Our current historical consciousness is not well served when we enable the delusion that the only usable past begins with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Yet, we need not start in 3000 BC either. Quindaro's immigration story begins in the early 19th century with the arrival of multiple Indian groups. People like the Shawnees and the Wyandots, who were removed from Ohio and played an instrumental role in establishing the original site before dissolving their tribal status in 1855. How did questions of U.S. Indian policy, settler colonialism, manifest destiny, white-native intermarriage, assimilation versus resistance, evolving definitions of proper land use and land ownership, the role of the Methodist Church and other churches that served as agents of the Second Great Awakening, not to mention conflicts between nomadic people and agricultural ones, how did all that factor into the founding of Quindaro? We don't know. Because prior to this symposium, at least to my knowledge, Native American scholars have not been invited seriously into the conversation. I suspect that by pursuing these questions, we will find Quindaro becomes more complicated, as a meeting ground, a nexus of sorts, between indigenous and immigrant people, white, black, and native, who have been actors in the drama. These questions will disturb us, because as my colleague Dr. Edwards explained, one person's freedom is inevitably another's tragedy. But I predict it will become more interesting too, for rather than a tale about territorial Kansas and the black freedom struggle, which we already think we understand, we'll discover Quindaro as a collision ground between East and West, North and South, colonial and indigenous, free and slave, frontier and settlement. In other words, one that encompasses most of the major threads of the early American past. Likewise, my fourth lesson involves a forward move, expanding Quindaro's story to the 20th century when industrialization and urbanization forever changed the African American experience. It has always intrigued me why history is defined as having occurred long ago. The work of Abelard Guthrie over the course of a few years deserves commendation, sure, but how helpful is that for understanding the situation of Quindaro today? For more than 7 decades, until its closure in 1943, Western University, the Tuskegee of the West, the first historically black college west of the Mississippi, symbolized the rise and fall of opportunities for young black people. The university, the AME church that sponsored it, Douglas Hospital, all provided valuable services for Kansas City, Kansas during the height of the Jim Crow era. Just as Quindaro's 19th century history cannot be separated from the native presence that preceded and helped create it, Quindaro's more recent story is inseparable from that of the families mentioned yesterday by LaDondra Ross, and in a larger way, inseparable from that of Black Kansas City, with its iconic foundations in music, as we saw, meatpacking, the Great Black Migration, and civil rights. This is the past that makes us uncomfortable. If scholars turn their attention to the site since the 1960s, they'll catch a disturbing glimpse of the disparity between myth and history, between Kansan's self-image of progressivism based on events that may or may not have happened 160 years ago, and its more recent tolerance of poverty, community devastation, and the legacy of segregation that has occurred within living people's memory. Some of this has already been recorded in oral history projects and is still ongoing with the KCK Public Library. That needs to continue. Gathered in this very room is an abundance of oral sources that could keep a small platoon of social scientists and urban planners busy for years, researching projects that would enhance our understanding of this community if they ask the right questions. Those questions include the role of infrastructure. Transportation may be the most consistent thread we'll find in this 200-year story. The community was born out of access to a major river. As railroads replaced steam technology, Quindaro's fortunes declined. If lack of access to a railroad damaged the settlement once before, is it fair to say it was damaged all over again after automobiles replaced trains and after a federal highway called 635 was built? Marvin Robinson taught me a new word for this yesterday: U.S. Negro removal policy, referencing the way federal infrastructure was designed to divide and forcibly relocate black communities. Thank you, Marvin. I'm going to use that in classes in the future. The uncomfortable questions include the phenomenon of middle-class flight, for as money, energy, and talent flee farther and farther from urban cores, they leave behind shrinking tax bases for people less equipped to deal with problems than before. And they include a hard examination of Americans' prejudices, of media perceptions about inner cities as dangerous and crime-filled, uninviting to prospective tourists, and therefore undeserving of the honorary title historical. These questions are not new. 20th century historians ask and answer them all the time. But again, they must be invited into the conversation. Clearly, as a professional historian, I believe Quindaro's story will be made richer and more relevant by taking a bird's-eye view approach that widens it over 200 years. That requires greater inclusiveness, which brings me finally to my fifth and last takeaway. How inclusive do you wish to be? Or put another way, who owns Quindaro's past, and who reserves the right to tell its story? As anyone who specializes in American Indian studies can attest, Native people are not always warmly receptive to non-natives flocking to their reservations and tribal centers every summer, intent on writing the definitive history of their experience. As a white professor myself who teaches African American studies at a suburban college, I try to be sensitive to the fact that there are aspects of my subject matter which I can never know and have no business representing. It seems to me, as I've watched the last 2 days, that the future of Quindaro's past will depend on your answers to these and other questions. All history is local, but how local does it have to be? Can history be owned, like land? By the way, Quindaro's original residents, the pre-Wyandots, didn't necessarily believe you could own land either. If the struggle to develop a meaningful site over the last 35 years has taught anything, it is that we lack consensus on the purpose of history. For some like myself, it is a discipline, an academic enterprise worthy in and of itself for the knowledge and insight it creates. But I acknowledge that that definition comes from a place of privilege, a place where historic preservation is a luxury. For others, and I include in this category my friends in the private sector with far more resources than I, history is a form of economic development, a means of attracting jobs and tourism, to assert community identity, and alleviate the desperation that comes with impoverished material conditions. As hotel and restaurant owners across the South have discovered with glee, history is big business. and nothing boosts sales more than an adjacent Civil War battlefield. The words cultural property have been used to describe the care with which Quindaro's story has been nurtured by its local community. Communities are born, they mature, they die, and new ones take their place. If Quindaro is going to be preserved for future generations and make unnecessary the archaeologist's shovel, or whatever they're going to use in the year 3100, it will require alliance building. Alliances are messy. They mean sacrificing control, watching private property become communal, and run the risk that the story will change, maybe even be corrupted, and impart values not in accordance with those of its original caretakers. It's not my place to say what the choices should be, only that difficult ones lie ahead. For what it's worth, I think the conversation will be well worth the time. The issues and stories that have been shared at this symposium, both by presenters and participants, go beyond Quindaro and beyond even Kansas and Missouri by cutting to the heart of why we need history. Thank you.